Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to the medieval world, where the story begins not with a king or a knight or a grand battle plan. It begins with a farmer, a tired one, the kind of man who wakes up before sunrise, argues with his donkey, and absolutely does not intend to change the course of history before lunch. And yet, naturally, he does. Now, imagine medieval Europe for a moment. Not the shiny version with clean castles and heroic music, but the real one. Slow, smelly, administratively confusing. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Land mattered more than almost anything else. Who owned it? Who taxed it? Who claimed it because their great-great-uncle once sneezed on it in 1123? And this is where our farmer enters the picture. His name in the records appears inconsistently, sometimes spelled one way, sometimes another, which is medieval shorthand for no one important bothered to check. Let's call him Martin, not because he was famous, but because half of Europe was named Martin at the time and no one would question it. Martin lived in a small rural village near a contested border, the kind of border that existed mostly on parchment and in the imaginations of nobles. To Martin, it was just a field with rocks, a field that refused to grow anything useful. Every spring, Martin plowed the same land his father had plowed, and his father's father before that. And according to village memory, which was taken very seriously, this land had always been theirs. Unfortunately, a nearby lord disagreed. This lord was minor, painfully minor, the sort of noble who owned just enough land to feel important and just a little enough to feel constantly threatened. Naturally, he was obsessed with borders. He had maps, very bad maps, maps that contradicted each other, maps drawn by monks who had never been outside the monastery. And one of those maps suggested that Martin's field might technically belong to him. So, one morning, Martin arrives to plow and finds a wooden marker hammered into the soil. Fresh, aggressive, slightly crooked. A symbol of authority, and more importantly, a direct insult to his routine. Martin did what medieval farmers often did when faced with abstract authority. He ignored it. He pulled the marker out, tossed it aside, and got back to work. This should have been the end of it, but of course, it wasn't. Because the marker came back, this time with a small banner and a seal, and a message written by someone who clearly enjoyed writing messages. The message declared that the land was now officially under the Lord's control. Failure to comply would result in punishment. Now, punishment in the medieval sense was vague, which made it more terrifying. Martin, however, was tired and annoyed, and not particularly impressed with seals. So he did the unthinkable. He plowed anyway. He plowed right through the boundary, right through the symbol, right through the Lord's sense of dignity. This was mistake number one. The Lord responded by sending men, not soldiers, just men, armed with authority and the confidence of people who had never farmed a day in their lives. They argued, voices were raised, hands waved dramatically. Someone mentioned ancient rights. Someone else mentioned divine authority. Martin mentioned that the land had always been his. And then, someone shoved someone. Historians disagree about who pushed first, which usually means everyone pushed at once. A punch was thrown, a nose was broken, and a minor nobleman's representative went home bleeding. This was mistake number two. The Lord, upon hearing this, did what all insecure medieval nobles did. He escalated. He called it an act of rebellion, which was ambitious, considering it involved one farmer and a muddy field. But words mattered. And once something was called rebellion, it took on a life of its own. The Lord gathered armed retainers, marched them toward the village, and demanded submission. The villagers panicked. They weren't rebels. They were just people, with crops and children, and very little interest in politics. So they did the next logical thing. They asked their own lord for help. And their lord, well, he couldn't ignore that, because if he did, it would look weak. And weakness in the medieval hierarchy was worse than stupidity. So now we had two lords arguing over land neither of them farmed because of a farmer who just wanted to plow in peace. Letters were written, messengers rode back and forth, each side accused the other of unlawful aggression. And naturally, they both appealed upward, to higher nobles, to regional powers, to men who saw opportunity where others saw inconvenience. By the time a count became involved, Martin's name was no longer mentioned. The issue was now territorial integrity, which is medieval language for, "This has gotten out of hand, but we can't stop now." Small skirmishes followed. Nothing dramatic, just enough violence to ensure no one could back down without embarrassment. Fields were burned, not Martin's, other people's, which is how these things usually go. Taxes increased to fund defenses. Villagers suffered quietly. Martin went back to farming, because at this point, what else could he do? Years passed. And here's the thing about medieval conflicts. They had a way of spreading. All it took was one alliance, one marriage, one offended cousin. Suddenly, neighboring regions were involved, not because they cared, but because they were obligated. A minor border dispute turned into a regional war, a war with banners and speeches and men who truly believed they were fighting for honor. Martin, by this point, was older, gray-haired, less interested in fields altogether. No record suggests he ever realized what he had started. And perhaps that's for the best. The war ended eventually, as wars do, with treaties that referenced land boundaries, boundaries that would be disputed again within a generation. Martin's village survived, barely, and history moved on. Because that's how it often works. Empires shift, dynasties clash, and somewhere at the beginning, there's a very ordinary person who just wanted things to stay the same. Let's drift gently onward from here, away from fields and farmers, toward the people who benefited from the chaos. Because next, we'll spend some time with the nobles, the ones who turned small problems into lifelong grudges, and made everything just a little worse. Take a slow breath, and let the story carry you forward. Now that we've left Martin in his quiet fields, let's drift, slowly, unhurriedly, into the halls of the people who truly turned his muddy disagreement into a prolonged inconvenience for thousands. These were the lords. Not great kings, not legendary conquerors, just men with titles long enough to require patience when spoken aloud. They lived in castles that looked impressive from a distance. Up close, they were cold, drafty, and smelt faintly of damp stone and ambition. The first lord involved, the one who claimed Martin's Field, was known among his peers as firm, which was medieval code for stubborn, deeply insecure, and very fond of hearing himself speak. He had inherited his lands young. Too young, really, and inheritance at that age tends to freeze a person emotionally. So while his body aged, his personality remained that of a slightly offended teenager. He kept meticulous records, or at least he paid someone to keep them. Scrolls, seals, signatures, all proving, in theory, that everything belonged to him. Unfortunately, reality rarely cooperated. This lord believed sincerely that authority was a matter of documentation. If something was written down, it was true. If it was sealed, it was final. And if someone disagreed, it was because they were ignorant or rebellious. Naturally, he took Martin's resistance personally, not as a farmer's confusion, but as an insult, an attack on order itself. And so he framed the entire situation as a test of whether people still respected hierarchy. They did not, but he would spend years trying to convince them otherwise. On the other side was the villager's lord, a slightly older man, more tired, less interested in proving a point, but very interested in not losing face. He had debts. Most nobles did. Castles were expensive. So were horses. So were the endless social obligations of pretending to matter. He didn't want a conflict, but he wanted even less to appear weak. And so he agreed to defend his villagers, not because he cared deeply about Martin, but because allowing another lord to seize land, even bad land, set a dangerous precedent. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords exchanged letters, very polite letters, aggressively polite letters. Each accused the other of misunderstanding ancient customs. Each claimed the moral high ground. Each insisted that peace was preferable, provided the other side admitted fault, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for violence while living in a stone fortress. They raised levies, summoned retainers, inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, and through it all, they reassured themselves that they were being reasonable. The problem, of course, was that reason had very little influence once momentum took over. Soon, neighboring nobles noticed. Some were related, some were rivals, some were simply bored. They offered support, advice, troops, not to resolve the issue, but to align themselves with whoever seemed most likely to come out on top. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords once again exchanged letters, very polite letters, increasingly impolite letters. Each accused the other of escalating conflicts. Each claimed the differences between inheritance rights in different regions. Each insisted that peace was only the ultimate aim, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for violence while living in a stone fortress. They raised levies, summoned retainers, inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, and through it all, they reassured themselves that they were being reasonable. The problem, of course, was that reason had very little influence once momentum took over. Soon, neighboring nobles noticed. Some were related, some were rivals, some were simply bored. They offered support, advice, troops, not to resolve the issue, but to align themselves with whoever seemed most likely to come out on top. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords once again exchanged letters, very polite letters, increasingly impolite letters. Each accused the other of escalating conflicts. Each claimed the differences between inheritance rights in different regions. Each insisted that peace was only the ultimate aim, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for violence while living in a stone fortress. They raised levies, summoned retainers, inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, and through it all, they reassured themselves that they were being reasonable. The problem, of course, was that reason had very little influence once momentum took over. Soon, neighboring nobles noticed. Some were related, some were rivals, some were simply bored. They offered support, advice, troops, not to resolve the issue, but to align themselves with whoever seemed most likely to come out on top. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords once again exchanged letters, very polite letters, increasingly impolite letters. Each accused the other of escalating conflicts. Each claimed the differences between inheritance rights in different regions. Each insisted that peace was only the ultimate aim, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for violence while living in a stone fortress. They raised levies, summoned retainers, inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, and through it all, they reassured themselves that they were being reasonable. The problem, of course, was that reason had very little influence once momentum took over. Soon, neighboring nobles noticed. Some were related, some were rivals, some were simply bored. They offered support, advice, troops, not to resolve the issue, but to align themselves with whoever seemed most likely to come out on top. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords once again exchanged letters, very polite letters, increasingly impolite letters. Each accused the other of escalating conflicts. Each claimed the differences between inheritance rights in different regions. Each insisted that peace was only the ultimate aim, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for violence while living in a stone fortress. They raised levies, summoned retainers, inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, and through it all, they reassured themselves that they were being reasonable. The problem, of course, was that reason had very little influence once momentum took over. Soon, neighboring nobles noticed. Some were related, some were rivals, some were simply bored. They offered support, advice, troops, not to resolve the issue, but to align themselves with whoever seemed most likely to come out on top. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords once again exchanged letters, very polite letters, increasingly impolite letters. Each accused the other of escalating conflicts. Each claimed the differences between inheritance rights in different regions. Each insisted that peace was only the ultimate aim, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for violence while living in a stone fortress. They raised levies, summoned retainers, inspected weapons that hadn't been used in years, and through it all, they reassured themselves that they were being reasonable. The problem, of course, was that reason had very little influence once momentum took over. Soon, neighboring nobles noticed. Some were related, some were rivals, some were simply bored. They offered support, advice, troops, not to resolve the issue, but to align themselves with whoever seemed most likely to come out on top. This is how medieval politics worked. Nothing mattered until it might matter later. The two lords once again exchanged letters, very polite letters, increasingly impolite letters. Each accused the other of escalating conflicts. Each claimed the differences between inheritance rights in different regions. Each insisted that peace was only the ultimate aim, which no one ever did. As weeks turned into months, both men began preparing, quietly, subtly, or as subtly as one can prepare for. By the time the dispute over Martin's Field was officially resolved, most of the people who had started it were already tired of talking about it. Some were dead, some were ill, some had simply moved on to newer, more fashionable resentments. But their children had not. Children, after all, inherit stories before they inherit land, and medieval noble children inherited stories thick with implication. They were told gently over meals. They were told more forcefully during lessons. They were told again and again until the past felt personal. This is how grudges survive longer than crops. The sons of the first lord grew up in a castle where maps were treated almost like sacred texts. They learned early that borders were not lines on paper, but proof of identity. That losing land, even useless land, meant losing honor. They were taught who had wronged their family. The names were repeated carefully, so they would not forget. The daughters learned too, though in a different way. They learned which families were untrustworthy, which names should never inspire comfort. Marriage, after all, was political, and politics was memory sharpened. Across the region, in the other castle, the same thing was happening. Different names, same tone. Children sat quietly while adults spoke of injustice, of stubborn neighbors, of past humiliations that had never been properly avenged. No one spoke of Martin. By now he had faded completely. If he was mentioned at all, it was as the incident, or that business with the land, which is a remarkable way to describe a war. The children grew. They practiced riding. They practiced etiquette. They practiced the art of looking calm while feeling superior. And eventually, they inherited. The sons became lords, the daughters became bargaining tools, and the old resentment settled comfortably into the next generation. What's interesting about medieval inheritance is how emotional it was. Titles passed down, yes, but so did tone. A son might inherit a castle, but he also inherited his father's voice, his sighs, his unfinished sentences. So when a border issue resurfaced, as border issues always do, it felt familiar, natural even. A minor disagreement over tolls, a hunting dispute, a question about grazing rights. Nothing dramatic, at first. Letters were exchanged again. They referenced older letters, which referenced older letters still. The past echoed politely, and once more alliances stirred. Some nobles remembered the earlier conflict, some only knew it as a story, but stories were enough. They chose sides, not always wisely, but enthusiastically. And so the region slipped back into tension, not quite war, not quite peace, just that uncomfortable middle state where everyone pretends they are being reasonable. The new lords, unlike their fathers, had grown up during the aftermath. They had not experienced the original chaos, only the justification, which made them bolder. They tested boundaries, literally and figuratively. Troops were mobilized briefly, then sent home, then mobilized again. Villagers learned to live with uncertainty. They stored extra grain. They whispered. And somewhere, in records that survive only in fragments, Martin's children appear. They were not farmers anymore. One had moved to a nearby town. Another worked land that was clearly owned by someone else. This was progress. They had adapted to a world shaped by decisions they never made. Meanwhile, the nobles debated honor. Honor was an exhausting concept. It required constant maintenance, public gestures, private calculations. It also required enemies, and so enemies were preserved. By the time the grandchildren of the original lords came to age, the conflict had become tradition. Not an active war, but a background tension, something to be referenced, something to be proud of enduring. Songs were written, very dull songs, but songs nonetheless. The field itself changed hands several times. It was taxed, then retaxed, then forgotten. No one farmed it well, which feels appropriate. Eventually, the region was absorbed into a larger political entity, a kingdom, then an empire. Borders were redrawn again. The old lord's descendants became minor players in a bigger story, their ancient grievances reduced to footnotes. But within families, the memory lingered. Old rivalries survived in seating arrangements, in marriage refusals, in the way names were spoken. This is how history sleeps, not erased, just quiet. And this is why when we look back, wars rarely begin where we think they do. They begin softly, with habits, with words, with stories told to children who weren't there. Martin, if we can return to him one last time, did not leave memoirs. He did not shape narratives. He lived, he aged, he disappeared, which is what most people do. And yet, here we are, still circling the consequences. Let's drift a little further now, away from land disputes, away from inherited anger, toward the broader pattern, toward the question medieval Europe never quite answered. Why did small things so often become catastrophes? Settle in, breathe slowly, because the answer, as always, lies with the people who had the most power and the least restraint. By the time we reach this part of the story, the original conflict has become something softer, blurrier, like an old bruise you only notice when pressed. The farmer is gone. The field barely matters, but the habits remain. Because medieval Europe was not short on land, or people, or ambition. What it was short on was distraction. Powerful people, especially nobles, lived slow lives, ceremonial lives, lives filled with waiting. Waiting for harvests, waiting for taxes, waiting for letters to arrive on horseback. And waiting, as it turns out, makes people inventive in the worst possible ways. The lords and minor nobles of this region, now absorbed into a larger political structure, found themselves with fewer decisions to make, which felt insulting. They still had titles, still had banners, still had ancestors staring sternly from tapestries, but their influence was diluted, and diluted power often turns inward. They began to obsess over status, over precedence, over who sat where at banquets. Tiny slights became deeply meaningful. A chair placed too far from the hearth, a name omitted from a prayer, a delay in formal recognition. These were not trivial matters, not to people who had very little else to control. And so the old rivalries found new forms. A marriage proposal declined, a hunting invitation lost, a legal complaint filed over something that had never been an issue before, all technically lawful, all deeply personal. The descendants of the original lords now competed in quieter ways, but with the same intensity. They argued in courts instead of fields. They manipulated charters instead of markers, and they were very good at it. Medieval law was flexible, interpretive, open to suggestion, which meant that those with time, money, and education could bend it gently in their favor. They hired scribes, advocates, men who could quote precedents selectively. And so the conflict continued, not as a war, but as a constant irritation. Villagers felt it most. Taxes shifted unpredictably, obligations changed, protections were promised, then delayed. The people below learned to endure. They always did. Meanwhile, the elites complained. They complained about unfair treatment, about declining respect, about how things used to be, which is usually a sign that things were never quite as stable as remembered. As generations passed, the story of the original dispute became less accurate, but more dramatic. Some versions involved insults that never happened. Others included heroic resistance that was, in reality, a man plowing quietly. Details blurred, intentions sharpened. And this is where history becomes dangerous, because once a story feels heroic, it demands repetition. Young nobles were raised on these embellished accounts, told that their family had stood firm, that they had defended justice. No one mentioned confusion, or exhaustion, or the fact that the land in question had never been especially productive. That part was quietly forgotten. Instead, the narrative became moral. Us versus them, right versus wrong. And once a conflict becomes moral, it becomes permanent. Even as larger forces reshaped Europe, plagues, reforms, dynastic collapses, the small resentments endured. They adapted. A family once defined by land disputes now defined itself by loyalty, or tradition, or resistance to change, which sounds noble until it isn't. By the late medieval period, the original war was no longer referenced directly, but its consequences remained embedded. Who trusted whom? Who married whom? Who was welcomed? Who was quietly excluded? History at this point had moved on, but people had not. And that is perhaps the most restful and unsettling part of this story, that nothing dramatic was required, no grand villain, no single moment of madness, just a slow accumulation of choices made by people who could not let go. Martin's field, long abandoned, eventually returned to pasture. Sheep grazed there. Sheep, thankfully, do not care about borders. They moved freely, a quiet reminder of how unnecessary the entire conflict had been. Records from later centuries mention the area only in passing. A tax note, a legal boundary clarified, a footnote. No mention of war, which is how most wars end up, reduced, flattened. But for the people who lived through the consequences, it never felt small. And so, as we settle deeper into the rhythm of medieval history, it's worth remembering this, that enormous events often begin without intention, that power magnifies triviality, and that boredom, in the wrong hands, is remarkably destructive. Let's let that thought drift with us now. No need to analyze it too closely. Just let it pass. Because in the next part, we'll move even higher up the ladder, to kings, to courts, to people who inherited not just grudges, but entire kingdoms. People who, given enough time and comfort, would make mistakes far grander than Martin ever did. By the time a crown reaches the next head, it is already heavy, not just with gold, but with expectation, with precedent, with decisions made by people who are no longer alive to explain themselves. This is the quiet burden of inheritance. You don't just receive power, you receive unfinished business. Kings rarely began their reigns with clarity. They began them surrounded. Advisors, relatives, courtiers who suddenly remembered how close they were to the throne. Each arrived with memories, with grievances, with helpful reminders of what had gone wrong before. And most young rulers were, understandably, overwhelmed. They had been trained for this, of course they had. Trained in ceremony, in lineage, in how to sit still while being watched. They were less prepared for contradiction, because the crown does something curious to truth. It makes disagreement feel personal, and advice feel suspicious. A new king might swear to rule differently, more wisely, more justly. And then the letters arrive. Disputes, appeals, requests to confirm old rights, requests to revoke them. Every parchment carries a version of the past, and each version insists it is the correct one. Somewhere in those documents are echoes of things like Martin's Field, not named, not remembered, but present all the same. A line here, a boundary there, a promise made long ago under circumstances no one fully recalls, and now, suddenly, it matters again. Courts debated, slowly, methodically, with great seriousness. Lawyers argued over phrasing, over which seal carried more authority, over whether a word meant what it once meant or what it should mean now. Kings listened, they nodded, they postponed, because choosing meant consequences, and consequences meant blame. So many decisions were delayed, deferred, passed down the line like fragile heirlooms. Meanwhile, life continued. The court ate, the court dressed, the court gossiped. Weddings were planned, funerals observed, children born into a world already shaped by compromises. And the king aged, sometimes quickly, sometimes visibly. The confidence of youth gave way to caution. Caution hardened into habit. By the time a ruler truly understood the machine he commanded, it was already moving too fast to stop. Which is how reforms become rigid, how flexibility becomes tradition, how solutions become problems for the next generation. This is the rhythm of monarchy. Less dramatic than it sounds, more repetitive than anyone likes to admit. A king resolves one dispute. In doing so, he creates 3 more. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Because power demands motion, even when stillness would be wiser. And so the old patterns persist. Borders are enforced, exceptions denied, privileges confirmed for some, quietly removed from others. The people adjust. Again. They always do. But above them, in chambers warmed by tapestries and belief, rulers convince themselves they are steering history, when often they are simply holding on. And history, patient as ever, waits. Not for brilliance, not for catastrophe, just for the next moment when someone, somewhere, decides that letting go feels too much like losing. Rest here for a moment. Let the court grow quiet. We'll move on soon, further into the centuries, further into the consequences. The crown will change hands again and again, and each time it will come with the same silent question. What exactly are you willing to keep alive? As the centuries drift forward, something subtle happens. Nothing dramatic, no single decree, no sudden collapse, just repetition. Courts continue to meet. Crowns continue to pass. Old decisions are referenced with increasing confidence, even as their origins grow faint. Tradition settles in, comfortably, like a well-worn chair that no one remembers choosing. At this stage, most rulers are no longer defending land. They are defending continuity. The idea that things must remain as they are, because changing them would mean admitting that the past was negotiable. And that is deeply uncomfortable. So traditions are repeated, not because they work, but because they are familiar. Ceremonies are preserved, titles protected, privileges inherited by people who have never questioned why they exist. This is how systems harden. What once required explanation now requires only reference. It has always been done this way, which is rarely true, but always effective. Kings sign documents they did not draft, confirm rights they did not grant, enforce boundaries they have never seen. And because the machine still functions, mostly, there is no urgency to examine it. The court hums along. Advisors rotate, fashions change, the language of authority grows more polished. But beneath it all, the same patterns persist. Someone feels overlooked. Someone feels diminished. Someone decides that recognition must be restored. Not tomorrow, not gradually, but now. And so a complaint is filed, a demand issued, a reminder sent. Small actions, respectable actions, the sort that can be justified easily. After all, they are only following precedent, which is how precedent becomes a weapon, not sharpened all at once, but worn into shape over time. The people beneath this system, merchants, farmers, artisans, continue their lives in the margins. They pay attention, but only as much as survival requires. They learn which names matter, which symbols to respect, which conflicts to avoid. They learn when to stay silent. This too becomes tradition. Children are taught caution, patience, the art of adapting without appearing to resist. And in this quiet exchange between those who rule and those who endure, history drifts. Not forward, not backward, just onward. Occasionally, a ruler notices the weight, the complexity, the way even simple decisions feel entangled.
They speak of reform, of simplification, of returning to first principles. These moments are sincere, brief, and almost always unsuccessful, because removing one tradition threatens 10 others, and each one has a defender. So the moment passes, the paperwork resumes, the crown remains. And somewhere far from court, sheep graze in fields whose names have changed many times, fields that no longer matter enough to fight over, fields that remember nothing, which is perhaps their greatest advantage. As we rest here in this long middle stretch of medieval Europe, it becomes clear that catastrophe is rarely born from chaos. More often, it grows from comfort, from certainty, from the quiet belief that what exists must continue. Take another slow breath. There is no rush. The system will keep moving, whether we watch it or not. And in the next part, we'll begin to notice something else, something familiar. The way these patterns repeat beyond medieval Europe, into later centuries, into new names, new banners. The same habits. For now, though, let it fade gently, like a candle burning low, not extinguished, just waiting. We'll continue soon. As the centuries drift forward, something subtle happens. Nothing dramatic, no single decree, no sudden collapse, just repetition. Courts continue to meet. Crowns continue to pass. Old decisions are referenced with increasing confidence even as their origins grow faint. Tradition settles in, comfortably, like a well-worn chair that no one remembers choosing. At this stage, most rulers are no longer defending land, they are defending continuity. The idea that things must remain as they are, because changing them would mean admitting that the past was negotiable. And that is deeply uncomfortable. So traditions are repeated, not because they work, but because they are familiar. Ceremonies are preserved, titles protected, privileges inherited by people who have never questioned why they exist. This is how systems harden. What once required explanation now requires only reference. It has always been done this way, which is rarely true, but always effective. Kings sign documents they did not draft, confirm rights they did not grant, enforce boundaries they have never seen. And because the machine still functions, mostly, there is no urgency to examine it. The court hums along. Advisors rotate. Fashions change. The language.
When we climb higher, past village disputes, past minor lords nursing old slights, we reach a quieter, heavier air. This is where the crowns live. Kings, queens, courts polished smooth by ceremony and distance. Here, problems rarely arrive muddy. They arrive folded, sealed, carried by messengers who have practiced looking calm no matter what news they bring. At this level, no one plows fields, no one argues with donkeys. Decisions are made indoors, beneath painted ceilings and carved beams, while someone else stands ready to refill a cup. And that changes things, because power, when separated from consequence, becomes abstract, comfortable, almost theoretical. A king does not feel a failed harvest in his hands. He feels it as a number, a shortfall, a complaint that can be deferred. Courts moved slowly, intentionally slowly. Ritual filled the hours. Audiences, processions, meals that lasted longer than some peasant lives. And like the lesser nobles before them, kings were surrounded by waiting. Waiting for alliances to settle, waiting for heirs to grow, waiting for rivals to make mistakes. And waiting, again, invited invention. At court, boredom wore silk. Petty disputes were elevated into matters of state. A careless remark became an insult to the crown. A delayed response became evidence of disloyalty. What had once been a disagreement over land now echoed faintly in greater arguments. Who had precedence? Who had ancient rights? Whose version of history would be written down and whose would quietly disappear? Courtiers learned quickly, not how to solve problems, but how to frame them. They spoke of stability, of tradition, of destiny. Words that sounded solid, words that felt important. And kings listened. Not always because they agreed, but because listening made them feel in control. Meanwhile, the machinery turned. Taxes were standardized, borders rationalized, old local arrangements flattened into neat categories. From above, it all looked like progress. From below, it felt familiar. Villagers adjusted, again. They always did. What's remarkable is how often kings believed they were correcting chaos, when in truth they were inheriting it, polishing it, giving it banners. A border dispute that had once involved a farmer and a marker could, at this level, justify armies, because now it was no longer about land. It was about authority, about precedent, about not appearing weak. Weakness, after all, was contagious. And so monarchs acted, sometimes decisively, sometimes disastrously, often both. They launched reforms that solved yesterday's problems. They enforced laws written for a world that no longer existed. They trusted advisors who told them what they wanted to hear. And history watched, patiently. Because history has learned something kings often forget. That scale does not change human nature. It only amplifies it. The same boredom, the same pride, the same reluctance to admit a mistake, just with better armor, better titles, and far greater consequences. So, as we settle here, among crowns and courts, it's worth keeping Martin in mind. Not because he mattered to them, but because he reminds us where things begin. Not with evil intent, not with grand plans, but with ordinary decisions made repeatedly by people who could have stopped and didn't. Take another slow breath. We'll stay here a while, among the thrones, among the mistakes that echo the loudest. The story, as promised, keeps going. Eventually, though it rarely feels sudden at the time, the medieval world loosens its grip. Not with a clean break, not with a final bow. It fades. Castles remain, but their purpose changes. Courts still exist, but their authority is shared, questioned, divided. Crowns grow lighter, at least in theory, even as the paperwork grows heavier. The old disputes, the ones that once filled letters and lives, lose their urgency. Not because they were resolved, but because something else replaced them. New taxes, new laws, new conflicts with more efficient names. And yet, beneath all of that, the habits remain. Because habits are remarkably durable. People still inherit more than they realize. They inherit tone, assumption, the quiet belief that certain things are simply the way they are. Long after no one remembers Martin, or his field, or the first time a wooden marker was pulled from the soil, the pattern continues. A small issue, handled poorly, expanded carefully, justified endlessly. Now it happens in councils instead of castles, in offices instead of halls, but the rhythm is the same. Waiting, boredom, power looking for something to do. History, despite its reputation, does not rush. It repeats at a comfortable pace. Each generation convinced it is managing things better than the last. Each generation quietly inheriting the same unresolved questions. Who decides? Who benefits? Who pays the cost? And, perhaps most importantly, who gets bored first? Because boredom remains dangerous. Not the loud kind, but the refined kind. The kind that belongs to people with time, with resources, with the ability to turn minor discomfort into major consequence. Medieval nobles had tapestries. Modern elites have different decorations. The impulse is unchanged. They fill the quiet with action. They fill uncertainty with structure. They fill ambiguity with certainty. And certainty, when unexamined, becomes rigid. Rigid systems do not bend. They crack. But usually not all at once. They strain. They creak. They shed pieces quietly. Someone adapts. Someone else suffers. Most people carry on. This is not a tragic ending. Not exactly. It is a soft one. The silence after history speaks is often the most honest part. After the decrees, after the arguments, after the names that once felt enormous and now sit quietly on a page, what remains is not resolution, but continuation. Life moving gently forward. Fields change hands without ceremony. Borders are respected more out of habit than belief. Old rivalries survive only as faint discomforts, the sort no one remembers learning. People wake, work, sleep. They do not think of the choices that shaped their routines. They simply live inside them.